Elon Musk might have a certain type of ethos on the world, but I don't think he's particularly steeped in culture beyond the odd MMORPG.
Welcome to Crashed, the tech podcast about everything else, whether that be economics, politics, philosophy, ethics, community, law, or literally anything else. This week, that means social media for children, or the lack of it, fascism being tied up with the algorithm, and, the death of democracy. I'm Alex Hudson.
And I'm Chris Stokel-Walker. Your backdrop is different, Alex. You are not in your usual place.
For the so few people that watch us on YouTube, it's embarrassingly few people that watch on YouTube. More people watch us on Spotify than watch us on YouTube, which needs to be fixed. So watch us on YouTube. I am up for the last Bradford City of Culture board meeting, and it was fun. But no, I am so sick. I'm sure you can hear that if you're listening. I'm sick enough that I tried to rely on an LLM to help write the briefings, and there is still a long way to go for that, because it makes you sound like a boomer on Radio 1 who's only had, it sounds like local radio from the 1990s. They are so bad at script writing. It is. I really wanted it to be good, and then I would save so much work, but actually it was just garbage. Yeah, how are you? Your background is exactly the same.
Yeah, I know. I rushed back home in order to do this. So my background is the same. With the LLM stuff, is it 80% Partridge? Is it like 70%? How far are we going here?
Oh, it's full Partridge. It is nice that it can't do it, but it also, because it now knows Crashed, of course, we're mega famous across the world. It really wanted to lean into it being a cool politics but tech podcast. It was awful. Anyway, before we get into the bulk of the program, we have two things. The first is, what are your predictions for 2026? We're going to do a big episode of predictions over the Christmas period. So if you have any, even if they're loosely tech related, they have to be at least loosely tech related. We'll be responding to a whole host of things. So send in video clips to either of us on social media, or you can message us on Substack, which, beautiful segue, brings us on to the second bit of our announcement. We're on Substack. Congratulations. Hooray. The first post is out, and it will be I've written weekly, but it's an occasional accompaniment as we grow out what Crashed is, what it might become. So it's Crashed, so crashed twice.substack.com, or just search for Crashed in Substack or my name, and you should find it. You can read our main post for free, and you can also sign up as we try and make financial sense of this as we move out of the pilot phase into the new year as becoming a real life, fully fledged podcast. If you become a founding member, we'd love you forever. And perhaps more importantly, you will get some extra stuff that we haven't quite decided what that is yet, but, join.
We're a scrappy new media entity. Bear with us. Is it building a plane as we're flying it? Is this the terrible trite phrase that we're meant to be using?
This is, we have no idea what we're doing, and we are figuring it as we go. So, on to our main big discussion points. A world-first ban on social media for under 16s has come into force in Australia. This means Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, X, which we still have to say used to be called Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, Twitch, and its Australia competitor Kik and Threads. It doesn't include Discord, Steam, WhatsApp, Pinterest, and any other service defined as messaging, gaming, or education. So by delaying access to social media, the eSafety Commission, the official body, said children will have more time to build real-world connections and online resilience. Non-compliance carries a fine of up to 49.5 million Australian dollars, which is just under 25 million pounds, and falls to social media companies, not parents, to enforce this regulation. So, Chris, in a world full of children reacting and everyone trying to build out global pictures of what is a very Australian story, what is the global picture of this, and what conclusions can we draw?
I think we can draw that Australia has supplanted Europe as becoming the most interventionist regulatory regime trying to tackle big tech, which is surprising because they've kind of been hovering on the horizon for a little while now. There've been these arguments that they've had, particularly with Elon Musk. There was a spat between the eSafety Commissioner and Musk over, as you said, X, the platform, which we always are legally basically liable to call the platform formerly known as Twitter. And they seemed to be trying to gain an advantage over X in those arguments around basically the polarization, the changes that Musk put into place after he bought it in 2022. But going this extra step to banning social media outright for under 16s, I think makes them the forerunner in this space. I also don't think that's a good thing. I mean, this is such a dumb bit of legislation that it is just ridiculous. But I do think that it's... Well, because we are both of a similar age. We both grew up on the internet. We have both turned out to be relatively normally functioning human beings. And I think that there is an argument to be made, relatively
you can
speak
for yourself.
Well, exactly right. But
tech journalists are not normal people. This is
in our public veneer, we attempt to do this. But I think the thing that concerns me is primarily you are cutting off what is now a really important form of communication for young people, and also a life experience that they will have to go through. And I do see the arguments for, well, the internet is terrible at the minute, and it's an awful experience for many people, and we don't necessarily want to expose kids to that. But I would suggest that it is better to try and inoculate them to that and make them a little bit world weary or a little bit world wary, don't know which one you want to go for, at an early stage, so that they don't fall into many of the traps that we're going to see, frankly, on the web, whether it is disinformation and misinformation as a result of AI, whether it is scams, whether it is sexual exploitation, whether it is just being slagged off by random people on the other end of a keyboard. All of those things, I think, will be more damaging if you go into this at the age of 16 as a kind of fresh-faced, naive individual who hasn't had a sort of baby steps approach to these sorts of things, and will be much more high stakes because at 16 you have potentially some sort of like additional income that you could lose if you fall victim to scammers, or you have sort of you are perhaps at a phase where you're exploring relationships, and so you're more likely to be caught out by like a catfisher or something like that. To me, it just seems really short-sighted and a kind of, just as I say, vibes-based response to a valid concern, but one that is effectively being made even more alarming by Jonathan Haidt's book, which, you know, we've talked previously, has some questionable claims in terms of being backed up by science.
So let me put Haidt's terms, sort of phrases to you directly. So this is a quote from a story in The Australian that was published today or yesterday. So he says, we really don't have a choice. The damage to children is so gargantuan. It's not just mental health. The bigger damage is the loss of the ability to pay attention. We see test scores dropping. We see IQ dropping. So we don't have a choice.
Correlation is not causation, number one. We are so early in this process that we don't necessarily know that is true. And, you know, the people who are the actual experts in this, rather than Jonathan Haidt, who, let's be clear, is kind of compiling other people's research and trying to present it to advance his narrative, which is what all journalists do, I admit, and things like that. But, you know, he's not the one on the front lines actually talking to the kids here. And it's interesting.
Some journalists do research and try to promote a balanced view, as I hope we both
I do that as well, to be fair. But yes, we do. But you know what I mean? Like there is this argument that you can cherry pick your facts, and I would suggest that perhaps Jonathan Haidt has admitted himself that he has this very strong belief around social media and the damage that it is causing. He doesn't try to detach himself from that in what he's doing. So I think that is a little bit of a concern. And we do have choices, right? Like we can pressure the tech companies themselves to do better. To suggest that like this is a pointless situation where we just have to throw in the towel and say this should be absolutely banned. No, like we can educate our kids. We can educate the people who educate our kids. We can speak to the social media platforms. We can put more pressure on them to make changes. We can work better as governments to try and do this sort of stuff. To say that we have to do this, to me, just seems... I mean, it's easy for Jonathan Haidt to say this, right? Because he's won, effectively. Like his book has managed to change an entire country's legislation, potentially for the detriment of its young people. And frankly, looks like it's not the only place that might be doing this. So, he can say, yes, this is the only choice because it suits him that this is the only choice.
We haven't asked him. We weren't. I wasn't expecting him to come up, so we haven't asked him anything. But if he does respond to any of the things, we'll put those to him, and we'll put those in the show notes.
I will also say that Jonathan Haidt has had a conversation with me before via email about these sorts of things, and he points to the research and says that it shows what it shows, and he does have a fair acceptance of criticism on that. We haven't gone to him for that specifically, but I have talked to him in the past about that, and I'm happy to represent that view on that.
So I think the thing where people should not have gone to so many people, the amount of children I've heard across the airwaves over the last 24 hours being like the absolute both sides and vox pops have been horrific. Like, oh, I think this, I think the opposite thing. Great, I've learnt nothing from you children. We should have more young people on the air. Absolutely fantastic. Have them saying things that matter. Don't just have them this arbitrary thing. They're just like, that's 3 minutes of just hearing children say nothing. Like, make them say things, have more voices in there.
It does show, though, and this is, not to get too meta on this, and we might not want to dwell too long on it, but it is an interesting sidebar. The challenge of interviewing younger people, children in particular, either in their early teens or slightly younger, it is a really nuanced thing. I remember having to interview, I think it was half a dozen young people about their smartphone habits for Wired maybe about a decade or so ago. And it really, not to be too journalistically meta, but it tests your interview skills to get them to go beyond yes, no, oh, I don't really know what I think about that sort of thing. I mean, it's a challenge. I don't really know where we're falling down here. Is it that you can't cram that into a vox pop, do you think, or what?
No, the kids were eloquent, but it was just about, it was actually the producers and the presenters of that, the vox popism of it means, and because it's such a political hot take, you have to show both sides, but the lack of depth to them was abhorrent. I think it's a good test of journalistic skills, but it's not that difficult. Kids will talk at length about anything they care about. It's just, they don't care about the things that old people think they care about. So actually getting them on an even plane and treating them like real humans, as, they are, that allows them agency to speak freely. It's when they think they're being railroaded into this thing where you've got the 17 private school children across the Today programme who are being used for quotes because they're the ones who can do the beautifully, very carefully, slowly constructed exactly what you want me to say here. And that should change. The amount of effort it takes to find children is exponentially more difficult. I take your point, but it's the lack of provision, the lack of education around what media means nowadays is a problem, particularly in the UK. But the second thing is more, the media doesn't speak for young people's issues. And when it does, it tends to have this, young people like computer games. Look, a computer game has been released. This is young people news. The average computer gamer is in their mid-40s and is just over, more likely to be female than male. So probably rethink that strategy. Rant over.
Indeed. I don't want to talk about, I don't think Lisa Nandy is a young person, but I think that she was quite interesting today on her broadcast rounds. She kind of, thankfully, I think, ruled out the idea of a similar thing happening in the UK offhand. She just said, this is not likely to happen. And the reason why I thought was fascinating, in part because she said they've spoken to kids about this and kids don't want it, which, also Turkey's vote for Christmas or whatever. But I do think that, the reasons why that the kids gave Lisa Nandy and gave the government for not wanting a ban in the UK were quite significant. And one of them was that they've had a strong cohort of young girls saying that they worry that if it's not visible the level of harassment that young females get on the internet, then people will forget the level of harassment that young females get offline as well. And that, to me, felt like a damning indictment, A, of our society, and B, a real justification for why we need to ensure that we retain that access to the internet for people, for young people in particular, is because they are way savvier than we give them credit for, way savvier than politicians give them credit for. And so to try and cut them off from this with some kind of Helen Lovejoy style, won't somebody think of the children approach, is just self-defeating in so many different ways.
So many points. So this could be long. I apologize. So I think, to your point around what the children want, I think the most reductive and polarized way to think about it is is social media either a video game or is it smoking in the way that we're going to approach policy around this? So obviously, we're not going to let with. Should children smoke now? Probably not. But then I went down a deep rabbit hole in this. And so in 1985, nearly 90%, it was 86% of tobacconists were still selling cigarettes to children. This is according to an ASH survey. And even though the health harm was well known, regulations have been in place for 20 years. But for computer games in the early 80s, I went down a deep rabbit hole around this as well. So it was the electronic games were different from harmless board games because they were interactive. So, of course, if you're of a certain age, as we both are, Mortal Kombat caused Senate hearings, Grand Theft Auto caused an international incident, yet there is no clear direct link between playing video games and negative health outcomes. This didn't stop the Daily Mail calling some of these games a direct cause of moral decay in children. So I think it's we don't know about the harms of social media. I think, Chris, you laid it out really, really carefully, but I think there is a lot of mental health concerns there, and I think we don't know. But there are people already likening Meta and other big social media companies to the tobacco industry, the tobacco lobby of 30, 40 years ago. And we don't know what the answer is. And I think there are already so many legal cases in Australia about whether or not this should be banned. So there's the advocacy group Digital Freedom Project. They have filed a legal challenge already. They've said this improperly robs 2.6 million young Australians of the right to freedom of political communication. So that means that fight back is already coming. But I think, does it cause harm? We don't know. I think probably if the number of percent of people cited in suicide attempts and self-harm related back to social media. So there are questions to answer, but what the UK does about it becomes really, really complicated.
What I think, so it's interesting, you cited the mental health harms, and that is absolutely a valid concern, and one that I think a lot of people point to when they're worried about the pernicious risk of social media. There was a separate discussion on the radio today that I was listening to, which was talking about the DSM, so the handbook for kind of mental health that American physicians use to try and refer to these sorts of things, and citing the fact that we're in the middle of a mental health crisis and like an over, again, this isn't necessarily tech, but this is crash. We talk about everything we said. The sort of over definition of mental health problems, from autism to ADHD to OCD and things like that. And they cited as one of their stats that over the last 70 years, the number of pages in the DSM, the first edition of the DSM released 70 years ago, I think it was around about 130 or something like that. And now, latest edition, which was released in 2022, is something like 1,300. So they basically said this is a 10-time increase. Now, to me, it's not yet shown whether or not, because we're talking about the rise of sort of mental health issues, and it's often attributed to social media. And because those two things have occurred concurrently, social media arrived in the last 20 years. Similarly, we're seeing a lot of people reporting mental health challenges and also mental health diagnoses in various different ways over that time as well. It's not clear to me whether or not that just happens to be at the same time as we're seeing an increasing awareness of mental health and therefore a kind of diagnosis of it. I think we still have to wait. It does mean that, it is a huge challenge at the minute, and whether or not you decide the risk potentially of this happening means that we should ban social media outright until we have that evidence, or whether we should let it continue until we have evidence to the contrary to allow it to keep going. Not sure which way we should go on that, but I just think there's a lot of people here who like to cite evidence that either doesn't exist or doesn't quite say what they claim it does for doing something that is really significant in a world where digital interactions are the most important interactions increasingly.
So to be clear, social media should not be banned for under 16s. I don't think there is enough evidence to show that it should be. And I don't think it's practical in any way. So I also think that UK civil liberties groups and tech companies are much bigger and much more organised in the UK than they are in Australia. And so that would see so many different litigations happen. What I think is likely, and here's where I don't know where I sit, is incrementalism. So, if we take the Online Safety Act, the UK has been slightly more pernicious or slightly more thorough or autocratic about the way that's been implemented. Australia implemented the similar Online Safety Act 2 years prior to that, and it's not done in quite the same way, and it's less aggressive. So you can see this incrementalism. So could it be curfews where they can't access social media after 9 p.m, design friction, or they get a sort of really pared back version like YouTube for Kids, those sorts of things. And without having that expertise within the government, and without having that expertise in those people advising the government, there is a real confusion about what is and what isn't allowed, and that allows still the tabloid headlines to rule what becomes policy and what doesn't. I think then you get into the issue around equity. So teenagers from less well-off backgrounds are already still, like, their mobile phone, they might only have one, might be their only access to the internet, and it means that the sort of kids from richer backgrounds tend to have better support networks, which means they'll get around it with VPNs, which means they have more devices to mess around with, and it means that then it becomes this class issue, and it becomes an even more complicated. And I think Lisa Nandy understands that. I think the way that the UK is positioning itself as this tech evangelist, so actually there could be a platform design race where there is more innovation in this space. That means the sort of grey areas of where kids are and are not allowed is more clearly defined. If the social media companies wanted to do this in a more metered, sensible way, Australia wouldn't need this legislation. And when it comes to moderators and the vast expense and the blurry lines about what it is and isn't allowed, as we talked about in a previous episode, when it comes to the sort of sex positive space, the LGBTQ plus space, here it has been monitored and viciously taken down when anything involves children. So it is possible. It's just not in the bottom lines to do so. That was a lot.
Deep
That was
breath.
full.
Deep breath.
It's fine. In the next section, we're going to talk about the death of democracy. So it only gets lighter from here. We'll be back in 1 minute. Welcome back. Now for something much lighter. The algorithm might have brought us closer to fascism. Told you it was going to be light. Global freedom has deteriorated for the 19th consecutive year, according to Freedom House, and around 8% of the world's population live in a full democracy, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, or EIU. The US is not seen as a full democracy, nor is France, Mexico, Brazil, and many others, as seen by Economist Democracy Index. And I've taken the most severe figures, but the picture is clear, and it becomes a literal picture with where fashion has been and where it is going. So we're going to talk about both of those things. You know, works both ways. You can take them all over fascist fashions, or fashion, as I found out that some people have been calling it today, or you can just take the dulling of counterculture. The easy bit is clear, so trad wife pro dressers, fonts that mirror Nazi propaganda, Valhalla references about a so-called purer West or Europe, and the number 88 or 88 popping up in clothing, a reference to Hitler as the 8th letter of the alphabet. But part of this is the more centrist or liberal fashion movement. So this has arrived with the chill it girl, quiet luxury, normcore, and all of those recent trends around conformity and not making a statement with what you wear. Meta Margaret, an applied aesthetic expert on TikTok, said, "Everything and everyone looks exactly the same these days, and it's not a coincidence. This is called cultural stagnation. So the average person is not developing their individual taste because we've traded it for algorithmic approval, which whatever gives us more social clout is whatever we're wearing." And this is where the tech comes in. So Chris, what does tech want us to wear?
Well, bland stuff, right? And things that will meet that societal norm that is increasingly being pushed in a certain direction. We saw, I suppose, lots of big tech companies starting to change their approach on January the 7th, 2025. We are now, nearly a year into this, and seeing, I think, the way in which we have these arguments over free speech. Notable that Europe, because of its interventions against platforms like X, has been singled out by the White House, not directly by Donald Trump yet, but by J.D. Vance in particular, to say that this is basically antithetical to what the US wants to do. And where Donald Trump wants us to go, I think that big tech is trying to shape us as well. So there is this top-down element, but then I suppose there is this bottom-up element where there are some people probably who are not necessarily realizing that they're embracing these fashion sort of aesthetics that we described, but are just doing it because this is what they've been told by that flattening of culture. I mean, on the more simpler side, it's interesting. I can't help but think that there are kind of echoes on the other side of the conversation we had a few weeks ago around how people who are either LGBTQ plus or who are sex workers are having to try and subvert the kind of blocks and bans and methods put into social platforms like Instagram in order to talk about what they want to do. In many ways, the kind of wearing of certain brands' clothes to try and signal your political allegiances is a similar way of going around it. You mentioned the use of the numbers 88. You've got kind of, you know, representing Heil Hitler. You have double H's. I've seen reporting around kind of clothes by Helly Hansen being worn because the logo has HH in it, and obviously they are not at all linked to anything to do with Nazism, but people are co-opting it as a kind of, you know, dog whistle to try and signal to others that this is important. I don't know what I make of this, Alex, to be honest, because I think it's concerning, but also there's just this steady drumbeat of this is unfortunately the way that the world is going at the minute. Can you try and make me less pessimistic? Can you give me a rosier outlook than this?
Well, in one way, yes, because if you look at the way that, so as much as they don't want to talk about it and they have apologized for journalistic credibility, Hugo Boss dressed the Nazis. So in that way, you know, fashion obviously was terrible. Now people wear Hugo Boss. Hugo Boss has no current relations, all of those things. I think when it comes to specifically to, I think there's two different conversations. So one is about how fashion reflects society, and there's all of this sort of hearsay, you know, real fashion does really reflect a society. And then actually I try to dig into whether or not there's any data to show that fashion does reflect society. There is no good data, unless I've missed something. If I have missed something, get in touch, because I would love to delve deeper into it. And so there's like the 20-year cycle with fashion, and now that's muddled because there is no sort of defining era, or there is no look of an era. So Matty Healy of 1975, not my favourite person, but he has talked about a similar thing with music fragmentation. So it's like, what was the best song of the 70s or 80s? You can say that and you know what the 1970s sound like, and you know what the 1980s sound like. And when you think about what 2025 sounds like, we don't really know that anymore. And when you think about what does the 80s look like, what does the 70s look like? And of course, you can only know in retrospect. You only get the sort of the pictures of what the past looked like when you're in the future. But what I don't know what it sounds like. I don't know what today's fashion looks like. And I think that is the hyperfragmentation of the web, stuff that we've talked about many, many times before. And so I think the algorithm wants us to create an emotion and be polarized, but it wants us to look very familiar and safe. And I don't know, I feel like that will change. Will that change? Is that more optimistic?
You'd hope so. I mean, you'd hope that there'd be this sort of countercultural movement. I think for me, though, the challenge is that this isn't just a digital thing, right? I mean, it's interesting that you talk about that inability to pinpoint a specific time period through their culture at any moment. Like, to me, everything post around about 2002 is like as current as today, effectively, because we haven't, as you say, got any individual culture of our own. And you could look at this through things like, you know, the endless sequels of the same movies that we see, or the remakes, or the live action remakes of animated films, or the animated remakes of live action films. Like, it's just, we seem to be caught in this very small c conservative cycle amongst businesses that I don't really know where that comes from. I think, you know, maybe it comes from the kind of economic precarity that we have now. People are much less willing to take those risks, and maybe they're much less willing to take those risks in part because business has come in and ruined everything in terms of it's captured our culture, private equity dealing with, you know, on our kind of area of expertise, buying up magazines, news websites and newspapers, and then trying to squeeze out every last drop that they can get from it while cheapening the experience. And so I don't know how we do that without some sort of kind of great rethink, but then you start to get into echoing the same sort of language of the people that we're trying to avoid, right?
I think the flattening of culture, the death of counterculture, and the sort of flattening of the pace at which things move, because suddenly once you have an algorithm, it's not you walking down the street and seeing something you think looks cool and then that taking 3 years to percolate and then it becoming this thing. And now brands are so wise on the Pinterest boards, on all of these different trend topics, there is no way of keeping it secret for long. I get it. But I think how that correlates with, I know Meta Margaret called it like this sort of pivot back to fascism, because people are being more told what to do, and it's more this sort of compliance with this sort of aesthetic because of the algorithm, and because the algorithms are being controlled by traditional voices, people in power, the white male voices, that becomes its own problem. But I also think the rise of social media does correlate with the downfall of democracy. Since 2007, there has been a significant shift from, I think it's 12% of people living in a democracy down to 8%. It was projected to fall to 5%, but there's no evidence that it is falling further. And I want to see somebody, some academic somewhere, link it directly causational, because I think or see if there is a point to be made, because that's where the real fun stuff is do the second that people get more voice on a thing or more agency over the way that their voice travels, more and more Gen Zs vote for authoritarianism, more and more young people think about the way that actually democracy is not really that good. And actually, given the state of polling in the US, more so than if you look at the forthcoming the French elections, where it is likely that a far-right party seeks to govern in some way, where does that responsibility lie? Is that just economic stagnation? Is that cultural stagnation? What is that? Easy question, Chris. So answer that. What of those things is it?
That's the question to which there is no answer. I think it's all of the above. What's interesting from what you said there...
That was the question on my list. So
that was, exactly, right? So there you go. But the thing that I think to have that kind of countercultural movement requires it being brokered through social media nowadays. And what's interesting is that social media, I don't see within the tech sector a champion for that at all amongst the lead. You know, not to say that we had this huge like champion of a movement. You know, it wasn't like the people leading Bell Labs or IBM or any large company in the 70s were championing a countercultural movement, because they weren't. But we had social spaces where those countercultural movements could be born and created and then amplified through those means, whereas now that is all online. And I don't think that any big tech bro has any strong opinions on culture in any way, really. Like, does Mark Zuckerberg have a favorite band or a favorite artist? Do you trust Jack Dorsey to kind of have a strong opinion on where we can be championing culture in some way? Elon Musk might have a certain type of ethos on the world, but I don't think he's particularly steeped in culture beyond the odd kind of MMORPG or something like that. Like that I think is the interesting challenge, is the people who could have the power to sway an algorithm to try and give us this distinctive moment in our society, I think don't really have any interest in doing that. I don't think they've ever had any interest in that, because they're not those type of people that are at all interested in those slightly softer skills, as they would have been described.
So I think Zuckerberg, according to The Guardian, wants to be sort of a more masculine energy culturally. I think with Dorsey, I think that's slightly unfair, because he sees a more sort of commoditization of the internet as a good thing. So that's more that socialist thing. And much of the criticism aimed at Dorsey, even though he's now a multi-billionaire because he's made Square one of the most capitalist apps in the whole universe. But part of his shtick was actually Twitter as it was this town hall, and actually it's this commodity where people can come together and talk, and that wasn't really about money making, albeit two sides of the same coin, Square. With Musk wants small culture. I don't want to know what Musk wants culturally, but I think that is small state. But that's not culture. That's just politics. He wants a tiny state. I think that becomes more complicated. I think, but the fact that culture then falls to these people that are sort of automatrons and cultural drones, to your point, I wholeheartedly agree with. And what you mentioned there was the three white men with the most power. Maybe not Dorsey anymore, but the head of Amazon and maybe head of Google and maybe Microsoft and a couple of others.
But what is? Even for that, like, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg wants more masculine energy. He said also he wants to celebrate aggression more in that interview. Like, that's not something that you can build a movement around. I don't think it's certainly not something you can build like a cultural movement.
The alt-right and the Andrew Tate Brigade. Yeah, that is a cultural movement. Whether or not you agree with it,
you can build that kind of movement, but you can't build like a. You can't build a. Well, I suppose you can. This is the challenge: is that we don't really want this. Or at least I don't want this. So maybe I'm just saying that you can't do this because it's not allowed in my world.
It is very difficult to build a liberal alliance and a liberal movement compared to it is much more difficult to build a culture of inclusion that progresses into a mass scale than it is to build a culture of hate, as many doctrines have showed. We said we were going to be more optimistic, and we said we were going to be more light. So hopefully someone will have a question in a moment that we will actually be able to laugh through. Be back in 1 second. Welcome back. Chris has to go live on the radio in about 7 minutes. So this is going to be quick because we are terrible at planning. So the easy question. Question 1. Chris, when does democracy die?
Oh my gosh. When does democracy die? 2028, depending on who wins the election and what the outcome is in the United States, I think.
Easy, done.
What do you think?
Problem solved.
When's your peg?
I'm not getting into that in the next 3 minutes. I don't think democracy dies. I think it maintains. I think there will be some sort of crash of an event, and I think it will become complicated, but I think it is deep. Question 2. How long until there is a self-driving car in London? This is pegged on the Uber Wavy trial scheduled for next year, and Wavy working a lot with Nissan, but it's scheduled for next year, but is it going to happen?
Okay, well, this is interesting. So I do have to ask a clarification question on your question for this, Alex. Apologies. I know that you're trying to rush me through. I'm much more calm.
You're on the radio, not me. I have all the time in the world.
Do you mean just any old car, or do you mean like actually a fleet of vehicles?
When will the first car that is sanctioned, not in trial, but sanctioned to be on the road as a self-driving car? There could be a person still in the driving seat, but the person is not in control, but it is legally allowed, and it is not just a test drive.
I think 2027, because I think that the government will push this forward very, very fast, but will come up against legislative issues. Nevertheless, I think if it was in an ideal world, the UK government under Keir Starmer would want this next year. I think what will happen is it will go through the parliamentary ping pong that makes it much more challenging to do that. But I think that there is impetus behind this, so I think 2027. In terms of actual fleets, I think we're still a long way away because UK roads are very, very different to other roads around the world.
I think the same thing. Well, I think similar things, but I think the trial will maybe travel into 2027. The idea that you can get an actual agreed licensing or ethics deal, or who owns who, or who's responsible for whatever crash through. I appreciate someone's thinking about it, but it's not going to get through Parliament anywhere near that quickly. So the trials will continue and the trials will become even safer, but I don't think there is that ability to move that quick. I'm going to go for 2029.
Would you get in a car like that before 2029 if you had the opportunity?
As a trial, absolutely. I would go tomorrow within a second. As a licensed vehicle without there being that safety net of it being in trial, I think I would look through the data, and as long as it was more than twice as safe as a human driver, yes. I appreciate that the legislation means it has to be at least 10 times as safe, but as long as I knew and was confident it was twice as safe, fine. Have you done it? I feel like you're the sort of person that definitely.
No, I haven't, because I'm up north, so I'm never allowed.
If you want to put Chris in a self-driving car, I will come and film him, and it will be beautiful. And actually, no one cares about that sort of 3-minute package where a news presenter is on there, but like, I'm in a car. Nobody cares. It is terrible television. Everyone knows what happens. It's safe. It's fine.
Done it 5 times.
It's terrible TV. Don't do it. What are your questions?
Mine was, do you think we will ever see news publishers compensated for AI overviews?
No, not even for...
Because of the EU introducing their antitrust investigation into Google over the use of AI overviews, which I think is a massive moment, because I think this changes the calculus for Google, where it's not just a bunch of individual little publishers standing up and saying, I'm Spartacus. It's kind of like a big behemoth behind them saying, actually, you have to step in line here.
The EU doesn't hold enough sway, and the news publishers don't have enough power anymore to be able to say, look, here are our terms, and here's what's happening. And I think the legislation might be, and the case might make it to actual trial, and there might be a thing of, okay, here are the damages. And Google will just say, fine, we'll just pull our content. And what do news publishers do then? Because on average, I think it's 40-something% of all news traffic comes through Google in some way. I think that will maintain as AI becomes more and more prevalent. I think that do you say no to Google and pull yourself off that platform in a way that some musicians are pulling themselves off Spotify? Spotify has incredible power in the music industry, but it has less power than Google when it comes to the news industry. It's a monster. But you think they're going to pay?
Well, I just think that, I don't know if they'll necessarily pay, but I do think that the EU, or the European Commission technically, getting into this space does change the power imbalance. I'm not saying that it fully levels it out, but I think that if you're a copyright campaigner, if you're a publisher, if you're just any rights holder, whatever, I think that you think that this was a big win this week, an enormous win actually, because while there's a whole geopolitics caught up in this, the potential of Google coming to heel, I think, is much more likely when you have a supranational body saying that they have to, rather than just a kind of ragtag club of people who dislike the idea of tech stealing their stuff.
And with Chris being on the radio in literally 3 minutes' time, that was plenty for today. There we go. We kept to time. Who knew? We've never done that. Crash is an Everything Popular is Wrong production. Follow us on all of your favourite podcast platforms. The title music is from Nuffer. Check them out on all the streamers. We're hosted by Acast, assisted by Ruby Star Studios, and we're published every Thursday morning. Get in touch if you want to say how great we are, how terrible it is, or if you just want to chat about literally anything, or if you want to subscribe, you now can. You can find me at Alex Huds on TikTok or anywhere. Follow Chris at Stokel on X. All these links are there. And if you want to support the podcast, go to crashedcrash.substack.com or search for Crashed within Substack or Google or wherever you want, and you can read us there. We will be back for a much more Christmassy episode next week.